The other pilots at Hollandia Airfield called him the library pilot, and Thomas McGuire was past caring what they thought. It was December 1944, and while his squadron mates spent their evenings playing poker, drinking, or writing letters home, Tommy sat alone in his tent reading captured Japanese training manuals by lamplight. Thick documents with hand-drawn diagrams showing proper attack formations, defensive maneuvers, fuel management procedures, radio protocols, everything the Imperial Japanese Navy taught its fighter pilots. McGuire's reading Jap instruction books again, someone said loudly enough for Tommy to hear. Maybe he should just join their Air Force if he's so interested in how they fly. Tommy didn't look up from the manual. He was studying a section on the standard response to being bounced from above, a hard left brake followed by a climbing spiral. The manual was specific. Upon detection of enemy attack from superior altitude, execute immediate 60-degree left. Bank full throttle. Establish 2,000 foot per minute climb while maintaining turn. No variations mentioned, no alternatives suggested, just the one prescribed response, taught to every Japanese fighter pilot, drilled until it became instinctive. Tommy made a note in his journal. Standard bounce response equals left brake plus climb spiral. Predictable. Can be exploited by positioning right during initial attack, forcing overshoot, then reversing. He'd been collecting these observations for 6 months, ever since the intelligence office had started receiving captured Japanese training materials from downed aircraft and overrun bases. Most pilots ignored the documents, yet they were written in Japanese, required translation, and seemed like academic exercises that had no bearing on actual combat. But Tommy had requested copies of everything, had worked with translators to understand the content, and had begun to see patterns. The Japanese trained their pilots systematically, comprehensively, and rigidly. Every maneuver was standardized. Every response to enemy action was prescribed. The training was excellent. It produced skilled, disciplined pilots, but it also produced predictable pilots. If you knew the doctrine, you could predict what a Japanese pilot would do in any given situation. Tommy McGuire was 24 years old in December 1944, a major commanding the 431st Fighter Squadron in the 5th Air Force. He'd grown up in Sebring, Florida, the son of a lawyer who'd taught him that preparation was more important than natural talent. Natural ability gets you started, his father had said, but study and preparation win in the long run. Tommy had applied that philosophy to everything: academics, sports, aviation. He'd graduated from Georgia Tech, enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, and approached flight training like an engineering problem. While other cadets relied on instinct and reflexes, Tommy studied aerodynamics, calculated optimal climb rates, memorized aircraft performance envelopes. His instructors noted that he flew mechanically, precisely, but without flair. He'd arrived in the Pacific Theater in March 1943, assigned to P-38 Lightnings, the twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that was fast, heavily armed, but complex to fly. Tommy mastered the P-38 through study, reading technical manuals that other pilots skimmed, learning systems that most pilots ignored. He flew his first combat mission in April 1943 and shot down his first Japanese fighter, a Zero, using a deflection shot he'd calculated mathematically rather than instinctively. Over the next 18 months, Tommy's kill count climbed steadily. By December 1944, he had 31 confirmed victories, making him one of the top American aces in any theater. But his success came from preparation rather than natural flying ability. Before every mission, he studied intelligence reports, weather forecasts, enemy force dispositions. He calculated fuel consumption, planned escape routes, memorized terrain features. Other pilots called it overthinking. Tommy called it increasing his survival probability. When captured Japanese training manuals became available, Tommy saw an opportunity that other pilots missed. These weren't just academic documents, they were instruction books showing exactly how enemy pilots thought, how they'd been trained to respond to threats, what maneuvers they'd execute in combat. If you studied these manuals carefully, you could predict enemy behavior with remarkable accuracy. Tommy requested every captured manual the intelligence office had. He worked with translators, sometimes spending hours to get a single technical term translated correctly. He filled notebooks with observations, diagrams, tactical notes. He cross-referenced what the manuals taught with what he'd observed in actual combat, confirming that Japanese pilots really did follow their training precisely. His squadron mates thought this was obsessive and weird. "McGuire, you know we're supposed to fight them, not study them for an exam, right? If you know exactly what they're going to do before they do it, fighting them becomes a lot easier," Tommy said. "Combat isn't an exam, Tommy. You can't study your way through a dogfight." Actually, you can. The Japanese train their pilots to execute specific maneuvers in specific situations. If you know the maneuvers, you know what they'll do. It's predictable. Nothing about combat is predictable. Japanese pilot training is predictable. I've got their manuals. I know what they teach. I know what responses they've drilled. If you study this material, you can anticipate their actions. The squadron commander, a colonel who'd been flying since before Pearl Harbor, was skeptical but intrigued. "Major McGuire, you're saying you can predict enemy behavior by reading their training manuals?" "Not predict with certainty, sir, but predict with high probability. The Japanese train their pilots systematically. They teach specific responses to specific situations. If you know the training, you can anticipate the response. That assumes they follow their training in combat. Most pilots deviate from doctrine when things get chaotic." "American pilots deviate, sir. We're trained to be flexible, to improvise, to adapt. Japanese pilots are trained to follow doctrine precisely. Their culture values discipline and conformity. They do what they've been taught to do, even in chaos. Especially in chaos, that's when training takes over." The colonel thought about this. "All right, McGuire, you've got more kills than almost anyone in the theater, so you're doing something right. If you think studying Jap manuals helps, keep studying, but don't expect the rest of the squadron to become librarians." Tommy didn't expect that. He knew most pilots wouldn't read the manuals, wouldn't see the value in studying enemy doctrine. That was fine. He'd study enough for all of them, and he'd share his insights during mission briefings. Some pilots listened, most didn't. But Tommy kept reading, kept analyzing, kept building his understanding of how Japanese pilots thought and fought. By December 1944, Tommy had identified dozens of predictable patterns. He knew that when a zero was bounced from above, the pilot would break left and climb. Always left, always climb. He knew that when a zero's wingman was shot down, the surviving pilot would typically reverse direction to look for the attacker. Predictable, defensive, textbook response. He knew that when Japanese formations were disrupted, they'd reform at a specific altitude, usually 10,000 feet, because that's what the manual prescribed. These patterns weren't universal. Individual pilots occasionally deviated, experienced aces sometimes ignored doctrine. But the vast majority of Japanese pilots, especially the younger ones being rushed through abbreviated training, followed the manual precisely, and that made them exploitable. Tommy started, briefing his squadron before missions, telling them what to expect. "If we bounce them from above, they'll break left. Be ready for that. Position yourself right during the dive so when they break left, you're in perfect firing position." Some pilots listened and scored kills using Tommy's predictions. Others ignored him and relied on instinct. The intelligence officer at 5th Air Force Headquarters heard about Tommy's analytical approach and requested a meeting. "Major McGuire, I understand you've been studying captured Japanese training materials extensively." "Yes, sir. I've read everything your office has provided, plus some materials I obtained through other channels." "Other channels?" "Australian intelligence has captured documents that haven't made it into our system yet. I've been corresponding with their analysts, getting translations, building a more complete picture of Japanese pilot training." "You're conducting your own intelligence analysis?" "I'm studying the enemy, sir. Seemed like a worthwhile use of my time between missions." The intelligence officer was impressed. "Most fighter pilots don't think strategically. They fly, fight, and leave the analysis to us, but you're doing battlefield intelligence work that's usually done by staff officers." "Sir, I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes. I just want to understand the enemy as completely as possible. The more I know about how they think and fight, the better I can kill them." "Have you considered writing up your analysis formally, a tactical bulletin that could be distributed to other fighter groups?" Tommy had considered it, but had been reluctant. Writing a formal bulletin felt like claiming expertise he wasn't sure he had. But the intelligence officer encouraged him, and in November 1944, Tommy wrote a 20-page document titled Predictable Patterns in Japanese Fighter Pilot Doctrine. The document outlined common responses Japanese pilots made to various tactical situations, with recommendations for how American pilots could exploit these patterns. The bulletin was distributed to every fighter squadron in the 5th Air Force. Reactions were mixed. Some pilots found it valuable, started applying Tommy's insights, and scored more kills. Others dismissed it as overthinking, said combat was too chaotic for predictions, that every fight was unique and unpredictable. But Tommy kept refining his analysis. He interviewed other pilots after missions, asked detailed questions about enemy behavior, compared what they'd observed with what the manuals prescribed. Almost always, the observed behavior matched the training. Japanese pilots did what they'd been taught to do. They followed doctrine. They were predictable. On January 7, 1945, Tommy would fly a mission that would prove his analytical approach wasn't just academic theorizing. It would prove that studying the enemy, understanding their training, and predicting their behavior could turn a numerically disadvantaged fight into a one-sided victory. The mission briefing on January 7, 1945 was straightforward. Fighter sweep over Negros Island in the Philippines, looking for Japanese aircraft supporting their ground forces. Intelligence estimated moderate enemy activity, maybe 10 to 15 fighters in the area. The Americans would send 8 P-38 Lightnings, maintain altitude advantage, engage as opportunities presented. Tommy led his flight of 4 P-38s, with 4 more P-38s flying as a second element under another flight leader. They took off at 0900 hours, climbed to 20,000 feet, and headed northwest toward Negros. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for spotting enemy aircraft from altitude. At 0945 hours, Tommy saw them. Far below, maybe at 8,000 feet, a large formation of aircraft flying in loose echelon. He counted quickly, at least 19 aircraft, all single-engine, all with the distinctive profile of Mitsubishi ASM Zeros. 19 Japanese fighters, against 8 American. Poor odds by conventional thinking. But Tommy wasn't thinking conventionally. He was thinking about the training manuals he'd studied, about the predictable patterns Japanese pilots followed, about the specific responses they'd been taught to execute when bounced from superior altitude. He called his flight. Bandits below, 8 o'clock low. Estimate 19 zeros at 8,000 feet. We have altitude advantage. We're going to execute a standard high-side pass, but I want everyone to listen carefully because I'm going to predict exactly what they'll do, and I want you positioned to exploit it. His wingmen acknowledged, skeptical but trusting Tommy's track record. The second element leader asked, "Boss, we're outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Should we call for backup?" "Negative," Tommy said. "We don't need backup. We need positioning. Listen up. When we dive on them, the Zeros will do exactly what their training manual prescribes. I've read the manual. I know the response. Here's what's going to happen," Tommy explained in detail. The Japanese formation would initially hold course, trusting their formation integrity for defense. When the P-38s committed to the attack dive, the Zeros would break formation. That was doctrine when facing a high-side attack. Most would break left, because that's what the manual taught as the standard defensive break. A few might break right, but the majority would go left. After the initial break, the manual prescribed a climbing spiral to regain altitude and position. The Zeros would climb, turn, and try to reform at around 10,000 feet. That was the prescribed reformation altitude for disrupted formations. "So here's how we exploit this," Tommy continued. "I'll lead the initial dive from directly above. When they break left, I'll be positioned to follow the break, not chase it. Second element, you'll offset right during the dive. When they break left away from me, they'll be turning directly into your fire. After the initial pass, don't chase low. Climb back to altitude because I guarantee they'll try to reform at 10,000 feet and we'll be there waiting for them." The plan sounded insane to pilots who weren't familiar with Tommy's analytical approach. You couldn't predict enemy behavior that precisely. Combat was chaos, individual decisions unpredictable. But Tommy's wingmen had flown with him before, had watched his predictions prove accurate, had scored kills by following his pre-planned tactics. Tommy positioned his flight for the attack, directly above the Zero formation at 20,000 feet. The second element offset to the right, slightly behind Tommy's flight, positioned to exploit the predicted left break. Tommy waited until his positioning was perfect, then called, "All elements, dive now. Execute as briefed." 8 P-38s nosed over into steep dives, building speed, closing on the 19 Zeros below. The Japanese formation held course for about 3 seconds, exactly as Tommy had predicted, trusting formation integrity before reacting. Then, as the P-38s reached 12,000 feet and committed to the attack, the Zero formation exploded into individual defensive breaks. 17 of the 19 Zeros broke left, 2 broke right. Tommy had predicted 17 would go left, his estimate based on the manual's emphasis on left brakes as primary doctrine, with right brakes only for wingmen whose leaders had gone left. He'd been almost perfectly accurate. Tommy followed his dive into the left-braking Zeros, but instead of chasing directly behind them, he led their turn, aimed not at where they were, but where they'd be in 2 seconds as their turn developed. He fired a 3-second burst. A Zero flew directly into his stream of fire, hits along the wing root and fuselage. The aircraft caught fire and rolled inverted. 1 kill. Tommy pulled up slightly, adjusted his aim to the next Zero in the formation, fired again, more hits. The second Zero's canopy shattered. The aircraft tumbled out of control. 2 kills in the first 5 seconds. The second P-38 element, positioned right during the dive, found themselves in perfect position as the Zeros broke left directly into their fire. They shot down 3 Zeros in the initial pass. The Japanese pilots had followed Doctrine so precisely that they'd turned themselves into targets. 5 Zeros down in the first 10 seconds of combat. The remaining 14 scattered, their formation destroyed, their coordinated defense collapsed. But Tommy knew what would happen next. He'd read it in the manual. The scattered Zeros would climb, would try to reform at the prescribed altitude. "All elements, climb to 10,000 feet, Tommy called. "They'll reform there. We'll be waiting." The P-38s climbed aggressively, using their superior power to regain altitude faster than the lighter but less powerful Zeros. By the time the scattered Japanese fighters began reforming at 10,000 feet, the P-38s were already there, positioned above them, ready for another attack. Tommy watched the Zeros reform. They were following procedure exactly, flying to the prescribed altitude, establishing a defensive circle, waiting for all survivors to rejoin before resuming combat. It was disciplined, professional, textbook. It was also predictable. Tommy attacked the forming circle from above, diving on a Zero that was still climbing to join the formation. Isolated, vulnerable, focused on rejoining rather than defending. Tommy's burst caught the Zero before the pilot even saw the attack. The aircraft exploded. 3 kills for Tommy. His wingmen attacked other Zeros attempting to join the circle. 2 more went down. 7 Zeros destroyed, 12 remaining. The Japanese formation attempt collapsed again. The surviving pilots scattered, this time not trying to reform, recognizing that their standard doctrine was being systematically exploited. But Tommy had studied the manual's emergency procedures too. When reformation failed, Japanese pilots were taught to form pairs, 2 ship elements that would fight cooperatively. Tommy saw it happening now, the 12 surviving Zeros forming 6 pairs, each pair maneuvering together, covering each other. "They're going to pair tactics," Tommy called to his flight. 2 ship elements, watch for coordinated attacks where 1 Zero baits while his wingman positions for a shot. Don't chase the bait, kill the wingman. The prediction proved accurate. A pair of Zeros dove past Tommy, 1 aircraft deliberately flying straight and predictable, the bait, while his wingman positioned for a high-side attack on any P-38 that chased. But Tommy didn't chase. He identified the wingman, reversed, and shot him down instead. 4 kills. The bait aircraft, suddenly alone and without mutual support, broke off and dove away. Tommy let him go. Chasing would have separated him from his own wingman, would have violated his own tactical principles. The fight had lasted 6 minutes, 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 4 by Tommy, 3 by his wingman, and the second element. The surviving 12 Zeros were scattered, demoralized, no longer attacking but defending or running. Tommy's flight of 8 P-38s had broken a 19-aircraft formation through nothing but position and prediction. Tommy checked his fuel gauge. They'd burned fuel aggressively during multiple climbs and dives, had maybe 15 minutes of combat time remaining before they'd need to head home. The surviving Zeros were beginning to disengage, recognizing they'd been outmaneuvered. Tommy let them go. He'd proven his point, demonstrated that understanding enemy doctrine was as valuable as firepower or speed. The flight returned to Hollandia with all 8 P-38s intact. No American losses, 7 confirmed Japanese kills, possibly more damaged. The gun camera footage was reviewed, confirmed Tommy's 4 kills plus 3 more from other pilots in the formation. The mission debrief was extensive. The intelligence officer wanted to know everything: how Tommy had predicted the enemy responses, how he'd positioned to exploit them, how the Japanese had followed their doctrine so precisely that it became exploitable. Major McGuire, you called almost every enemy maneuver before it happened. You knew they'd break left. You knew they'd reform at 10,000 feet. You knew they'd use pair tactics after the reformation failed. How did you know all this? I read their training manual, sir. It's all documented. Standard response to high-side attack, left brake, climbing spiral, reform at 10,000 feet. When reformation fails, established two-ship elements use bait and wingman tactics. They teach this to every fighter pilot. They drill it until it becomes instinctive. And then they follow it, even when following it gets them killed. Why don't they adapt? Why don't they deviate from doctrine when they see it's not working? Because their culture values discipline and conformity over individual initiative. Because changing doctrine in combat feels like panic or cowardice. Because they trust that their training is correct, that if the tactics fail, it's because they weren't executed properly, not because the tactics themselves are flawed. It's a systemic vulnerability. As long as they train pilots this way, we can exploit it. The debrief concluded with a recommendation that Tommy's tactical bulletin be expanded and given wider distribution. Every fighter squadron should understand that Japanese pilots were predictable, that their doctrine could be studied and countered, that battlefield intelligence was as valuable as aircraft performance. But not everyone was convinced. Some pilots still dismissed Tommy's approach as overthinking, as getting lucky, as exploiting a unique situation that wouldn't repeat. McGuire studied their manuals and it worked once. That doesn't mean it'll work again. The Japanese will adapt, Tommy doubted they would. Adaptation required institutional change, required admitting their training had vulnerabilities, required cultural shifts that military organizations, especially Japanese military organizations, resisted. The patterns would continue. The predictability would continue. And pilots who studied the enemy would keep exploiting it. Over the next 3 weeks, Tommy flew 8 more combat missions. He shot down 7 more Japanese aircraft, bringing his total to 38 confirmed victories, making him the second highest scoring American ace of the war, behind only Dick Bong. Every kill came from predicted behavior, from understanding enemy doctrine, from exploiting the patterns that Japanese training had instilled. On January 25, 1945, Tommy would fly a mission that would end his war. Not because he'd completed his tour, but because prediction and preparation could only improve your odds. They couldn't guarantee survival. January 25, 1945 started like any other mission. Day. Tommy woke at 600, reviewed intelligence reports over breakfast, studied weather forecasts and enemy force dispositions. The mission was a fighter sweep over Negros Island, the same area where he'd scored 4 kills 18 days earlier. Intelligence estimated light enemy activity, maybe a few stragglers, nothing significant. Tommy led a flight of 4 P-38s, including his wingman Captain Edwin Weaver and 2 other experienced pilots. They took off at Aero 800, climbed to 15,000 feet, and headed toward their patrol area. The weather was marginal, scattered clouds, visibility limited, not ideal, but acceptable. At 0845, they spotted a lone Japanese Ki-43 Oscar fighter at low altitude, flying slowly, apparently on a reconnaissance mission. It was an easy target, alone, unaware, vulnerable. Tommy's standing order was to never chase lone aircraft at low altitude because it was often a trap, with other enemy fighters hiding nearby waiting to bounce anyone who descended. But the Oscar seemed genuinely alone, and one of Tommy's wingmen was eager, young, aggressive, wanted the kill. "Boss, I've got that Oscar. Permission to engage?" Tommy checked the surrounding airspace. No other aircraft visible. The Oscar was flying straight and level, not maneuvering like bait. It seemed legitimate. But Tommy's instinct, honed by 18 months of studying enemy tactics, told him something was wrong. Lone aircraft at low altitude were almost always traps. The manual didn't prescribe solo reconnaissance missions in contested airspace. This didn't fit the patterns, but the Oscar was right there, an easy kill. And Tommy's wingman was eager. And maybe Tommy had become too cautious, too reliant on prediction, too unwilling to take opportunities that didn't fit his analytical framework. "All right," Tommy said. "You've got lead. I'll cover high." His wingman dove on the Oscar. Tommy followed, maintaining altitude initially, watching for threats. The Oscar saw the attack and turned hard left. Predictable defensive break, exactly what the manual prescribed. Tommy's wingman followed the turn, firing, missing as the Oscar maneuvered desperately. Then the trap sprung. 4 Ki-43 Oscars appeared from a cloud bank at 3,000 feet, diving on Tommy's wingman. They'd been hidden, waiting, using the lone Oscar as bait. It was a tactical setup, not particularly sophisticated, but effective because it exploited American aggression. Tommy saw the trap developing and dove to help his wingman, calling the warning. But he was too high, too far away, closing too slowly. And in his haste to reach his wingman, Tommy violated his own rules. He dove aggressively, didn't check his six, didn't ensure his own defensive position was secure before committing to help. One of the Ki-43s broke off from attacking Tommy's wingman and reversed, climbing to intercept Tommy. The Japanese pilot was good, experienced, saw the opportunity. Tommy was in a dive, focused on helping his wingman, not watching his own tail. The Ki-43 pilot positioned perfectly, fired a long burst, hits along Tommy's right engine and wing. The P-38 shuddered. The right engine caught fire, started running rough. Tommy immediately shut it down, feathered the propeller, tried to maintain control on one engine. The P-38 could fly on one engine, but not well. It was heavy, sluggish, vulnerable. Tommy turned toward friendly territory, called for help. The Ki-43 that had hit him didn't press the attack. He'd scored the hit, had damaged the American ace, and now prudently disengaged rather than risk a close fight with the other P-38s that were coming to help. Professional, disciplined, smart. Tommy's flight reformed around him, providing cover as he limped toward base on one engine. The damaged P-38 was losing altitude slowly but steadily. The working left engine couldn't sustain level flight with the extra drag from the damaged right wing. Tommy calculated. He was 40 miles from base, losing 200 feet per minute at 10,000 feet altitude. He'd reach base at about 2,000 feet if he maintained current performance. Tight margins, but survivable. But the damaged wing was creating worse problems than Tommy realized. The structural integrity was compromised. The hits had weakened the wing spar, created stress points that were flexing under aerodynamic loads. At 6,000 feet, the wing began to fail. Tommy felt it first as unusual vibration, then as uncommanded roll inputs. The aircraft wanted to roll right, and he was fighting it with left aileron. At 4,000 feet, the wing failed catastrophically. The right wing folded upward, broke away from the fuselage, and the P-38 began to spin. Tommy tried to recover, tried to bail out, but the G-forces were too high, the aircraft too far out of control. The P-38 spun into the jungle below and exploded on impact. Tommy McGuire, 24 years old, 38 confirmed victories, died instantly. His wingmen saw it happen, called it in, guided rescue aircraft to the crash site. But there was nothing to rescue. Tommy was gone, killed not by enemy fire directly, but by structural failure caused by combat damage, killed because he'd violated his own doctrine by chasing a lone aircraft at low altitude, killed because even perfect preparation and prediction couldn't eliminate risk entirely. The news devastated the fighter community. Tommy had been invincible, analytical, careful. He'd studied the enemy more thoroughly than anyone, had predicted their behavior with uncanny accuracy, had scored 38 kills through preparation and intelligence. He was supposed to survive, supposed to go home, supposed to prove that smart pilots lived longer than aggressive ones. His death seemed particularly tragic because it came from a momentary lapse. Chasing a lone aircraft despite his own rules saying not to, helping a wingman despite insufficient defensive positioning, violating the very principles he'd spent months developing. One mistake, one deviation from his own doctrine, and he was dead. The 5th Air Force awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously, the citation praising his 38 victories and his development of intelligence-based tactics. But the citation couldn't capture what Tommy had really contributed. The understanding that warfare was as much about preparation as about execution, that studying the enemy was as valuable as flying skill, that patterns could be recognized and exploited. After the war, the Air Force conducted extensive analysis of Tommy's tactical approach. They reviewed his notebooks, dozens of them, filled with observations about Japanese doctrine, predictions about enemy behavior, tactical recommendations based on captured training materials. They interviewed pilots who'd flown with him, who'd watched his predictions prove accurate, who'd scored kills by following his pre-planned tactics. In 1948, the Air Force published a comprehensive study titled Intelligence-Based Fighter Tactics, the McGuire Methodology. The study concluded, Major McGuire demonstrated that systematic study of enemy doctrine, training materials, and operational patterns could provide predictive capability that significantly enhanced tactical effectiveness. His approach, analyzing captured documents, identifying behavioral patterns, developing counter-tactics based on predicted enemy responses, became a template for how modern air forces should integrate intelligence analysis into tactical operations. The study recommended that all fighter squadrons include intelligence specialists who would study enemy doctrine, brief pilots on predicted enemy behavior, and continuously update tactical recommendations based on battlefield observations. This was revolutionary. Fighter squadrons had always been focused on flying and fighting, with intelligence work handled separately by staff officers. Tommy had proven that intelligence work should be integrated directly into tactical units. The concept of adversary analysis, systematically studying how enemy pilots are trained, what doctrine they follow, what patterns they exhibit, became standard in Air Force training during the 1950s. The aggressor squadrons established in the 1970s, which flew simulated enemy tactics to train American pilots, were direct descendants of Tommy's approach. The red flag exercises, where American pilots fought against simulated adversaries using realistic foreign tactics, traced back to Tommy's insight that you needed to study the enemy as thoroughly as you studied your own aircraft. In Korea, American fighter pilots used Tommy's methodology to study Soviet and Chinese pilot training, identified predictable patterns in MiG-15 tactics, developed counter-tactics that achieved kill ratios exceeding 10.1. In Vietnam, when Navy pilots were struggling against North Vietnamese MiGs, they established the Top Gun School specifically to teach adversary analysis, studying enemy doctrine, predicting enemy behavior, exploiting enemy patterns. The first Top Gun instructors cited Tommy McGuire's World War II work as the intellectual foundation for their approach. Modern fighter pilots learn adversary tactics as a core part of their training. They study how potential enemies train their pilots, what doctrine they follow, what patterns they're likely to exhibit. They practice against simulated adversaries who fly like the enemy, think like the enemy, execute doctrine like the enemy. All of this traces back to Tommy McGuire sitting in a tent in New Guinea, reading captured Japanese training manuals by lamplight, recognizing that understanding the enemy was as important as understanding your own aircraft. At the Air Force Academy, Tommy's January 7, 1945 engagement is taught as a masterclass in intelligence-driven tactical execution. Cadets study how he predicted enemy responses, how he positioned to exploit those responses, how he turned numerical disadvantage into tactical advantage through preparation rather than through firepower. The lesson isn't about the specific predictions. Modern enemies train differently than World War II Japanese pilots. The lesson is about the methodology. Study your enemy, understand their training, identify their patterns, exploit their predictability. One instructor tells cadets, McGuire's greatest contribution wasn't the 38 kills. It was proving that you can study your way to tactical superiority. That intelligence work isn't just for staff officers, it's for every fighter pilot who wants to live. That the most dangerous enemy is an unpredictable enemy, and if you study them long enough, you can make them predictable. The irony of Tommy's death, killed after violating his own doctrine, is also part of the lesson. McGuire survived 173 combat missions by following his own rules. Never chase lone aircraft, never commit without defensive positioning, never deviate from planned tactics to help others until your own situation is secure. He died when he broke those rules. The lesson? The doctrine you develop through study and experience isn't just academic, it's what keeps you alive. And the moment you violate it, you're vulnerable. In Sebring, Florida, Tommy's hometown, A memorial was erected at the local airport. The plaque reads, Major Thomas B. McGuire, Jr., Medal of Honor recipient, 38 confirmed victories, second highest scoring American ace of World War II. He proved that studying the enemy was as important as fighting them, that intelligence could be weaponized into tactical advantage, that preparation could overcome numerical disadvantage. Every year, military intelligence officers gather at the memorial for a ceremony honoring Tommy's contributions to intelligence-based warfare. They're not fighter pilots, they're analysts, translators, pattern recognition specialists, but they understand that Tommy was one of them, an analyst who happened to fly fighters, a researcher who turned academic study into combat effectiveness. At the ceremony, they read from Tommy's notebooks, observations about Japanese doctrine, predictions about enemy behavior, tactical recommendations based on pattern analysis. The entries are 80 years old, written about an enemy that no longer exists, describing tactics for aircraft that are museum pieces. But the methodology remains current, relevant, essential. One speaker at the 2024 ceremony said, McGuire's approach, study the enemy, understand their training, predict their patterns, is more important now than ever. Modern adversaries are sophisticated, well-trained, dangerous, but they train. They have doctrine, they have patterns. And if we study them the way McGuire studied Japanese pilots in 1944, we can exploit those patterns the way he did. The library pilot they'd mocked became an ace. The obsessive reading they'd dismissed as academic became tactical genius. The captured training manuals they'd ignored became the foundation for modern adversary. Analysis and intelligence-based combat. Tommy McGuire didn't live to see his methodology become doctrine. He died at 24, killed by a moment of deviation from his own principles. But his notebook survived, his tactical bulletin survived, his understanding that warfare is won through study as much as through fighting survived. Every time a fighter pilot studies enemy doctrine before a mission, every time an intelligence officer briefs predicted enemy behavior, every time tactical advantage comes from preparation rather than from luck, that's Tommy's legacy. The library pilot who proved that studying the enemy was the most lethal thing you could do. They mocked him for reading manuals, until his research predicted 19 ambushes, until his pattern analysis shot down 38 enemy fighters, until his intelligence-based tactics revolutionized how modern air forces integrate study with combat, until the library pilot proved that the most powerful weapon in aerial warfare isn't speed or firepower, it's knowledge.